Hello and welcome to the Logos broadcast. In this episode, John Waters discusses his second book, Race of Angels. This work, published in 1994, is about U2 and their fitting into a tapestry of particularly Irish cultural phenomena that John says was essential and not incidental to their formation and success. The story of U2 has run alongside some of the most drastic technological and cultural changes that have ever taken place. Race of Angels explores the effects that some of these changes have had on how we interact with each other and with reality, with reference to the work of media theorists and philosophers such as McLuhan and Umberto Eco. Ireland's experience of the postcolonial condition is something that John also goes into, drawing substantially on the work of Franz Fanon. With the benefit of 30 more years of hindsight and experience, in this interview John has a fresh opportunity to reflect on what these thinkers were saying. While being a vocal critic of what is called the establishment, John notes that the cultural landscape of the resistance movement is also quite unsatisfactory, lacking vision and inspiration. These cultural problems must be addressed if solutions to Ireland's political problems are to be found. This interview starts with John recounting how he ended up getting to do an interview with Bono in 1992. John thought Bono wouldn't want to meet him because 6 years before, John had written a very critical article about U2 and Self-Aid, an unemployment charity concert in Dublin, in which U2 were involved.
Yeah, so then actually what happened when I went to the Irish Times, then it was like a good maybe, that was 1986, so 1982, when I was in the Irish Times, they asked me would I do an interview with Bono, and I said, "You have to be joking." He says, "I say he hates me."
Right.
But I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll tell you what. I'll write him a letter, and he won't. I'll just so." So I wrote Bono a letter and explained, and I said, "This is going to make you laugh, but I'd like to ask to do an interview with you." And he came right back and said, "Okay."
Wow.
So I went to Milan and interviewed him in Milan. And it was a phenomenal thing, I'll never forget it. Imagine, arrived in the fucking airport and had a police outrider escort into the fucking middle of Milan. It was this big fucking limousine and police every side of me. And just me. Oh, fuck. But I did the interview and it was really good. And then I did this interview with him then, later, about this thing. The concept was about Ireland. It's about Ireland kind of coming around out of colonialism and becoming a modern nation, and what does that mean and all that, And I talked to a lot of guys, Ivor Brown and loads of people, but Bono says to me afterwards, do you want to go for after we did the interview, he says, I forget where we did it, down in his office, down the principal management office, I think, and there was a limo again, and he says, "Let's go get something to eat. I'll go up to my brother's place up on Suffolk Street." He had a brother. His brother had a restaurant up there. So, and on the way, he says, "This is a book. You should write a book about this." Because I've been talking about the music, and is it fundamentally the question I was trying to address with you too? It's in the book. Is the fact that they're Irish material to their success, or is it just, as we kind of in Ireland think,
an accident?
Jesus, isn't it amazing? And they're Irish, sick, Jesus. Huh? But I said, no, it's actually because they're Irish that they did this, and that was my belief, and that's the one. So that's why I did the book, and it's a very tenuous book. I'm sure you know what I mean. It's kind of a tenuous argument, but it's enough to suggest the possibility, and then it's up to you then to think if that might be true. Is it even remotely possible that Andreas McCrae song somehow found its way back into Bono's head in a different idiom, a couple of hundred years later? The
argument is inherently difficult to make in a kind of in a world where everything has to be demonstrated by exact A leads to B, and so on. It's
forensic evidence and all that. Yeah, sure.
And that's a kind of a broader.
Well,
that's a broader feature in every kind of conversation. But it's interesting that it taps into that. It's nearly like it's on another plane.
It is, yeah.
That you can't.
It actually, I have to be honest and say
you can't argue it scientifically.
No. You can only insinuated. Like I was very influenced by another music writer called Paul Morley, who wrote a book called Words in Music. I'm pretty sure that came before. Maybe he didn't. But his style anyhow was very like that, you know. He would say something absolutely bombastic. And, you know, he would kind of, like, he did this anyway, whether it was before or after, he did this, the history of rock and roll. And he starts a series of events as is one section of it. And says first the Big Bang, and he puts the date of the Big Bang on.
Right.
And then he goes from there. And you know, the first cry, and, you know, the blues, you know, and all that. And so yeah, but I just wanted to kind of put it all down in that way. That yeah. So there are different kind of elements in it. Like, but the funny thing about it was, you know, when I gave the manuscript to the publishers, there were two publishers, Blackstaff and Fort Estate. Fort Estate in England were the British publishers, and Blackstaff were the Irish publishers. Same book, but they kind of combined. And when I gave it to Fort Estate, the editor rang me up one day when she got this stuff, and she was talking about that section about Mike Cooley, and she said, "Is he like Bono's granddad or something?" I said, "No, he's nothing to Bono." And so I couldn't explain to her why it was in the book.
And was she basically saying what are his credentials? Is that what she was asking?
No, she was going, no, but kind of why is he in a book about U2? But I said the book isn't about U2.
Right.
I said it's about something else, which is kind of involves U2, and they're the emblem of the thing, but they're not what it's about. So that's why I put in the end, well, at the end of the chapter, about the section, which is, I think, brilliant. I read this. I used to read this, even though I didn't write a word of it. It's all Mike Cooley.
Is this the bit about the statue or the
yeah,
sculpture?
the statue, yeah.
The shape of an angel?
Yeah.
Yeah, page 250.
Yeah. Okay. And then I start a random story from the U2 homeland. You see, I'm trying to... And then at the end I say, Professor Mike Cooley, in a conversation with the author, Professor Cooley is an engineer and one of the world's leading technological philosophers. His hometown, Tuam, County Galway, was also the birthplace of Johnny Rotten's father.
He's a Sex Pistols guy.
Yeah. So there's my get out of jail card.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd have to try and explain the inexplicable, you know.
But there's a bit in the book where you discuss Bertie Ahern, and he said that they're more than just rock and roll full stop men.
Yeah.
And then there's also a bit about the picture with Charlie Haughey and how relatively awkward and how uncomfortable Haughey looked with U2, who looked so relaxed.
Yeah.
And there's something, I think, that the Irish politicians at the time didn't get, right? So, and you've mentioned this book before.
Oh,
I don't know if you have a copy of it.
The book I'm handing to John at this point in the interview is The Spirit of the Nation, the speeches and statements of Charles J. Haughey, 1957 to 1986, which was edited by Martin Manser. It's made up of 1,216 large pages and weighs 2.3 kilograms, or 5 pounds. John had told me in a previous interview, I don't think anybody read it.
I have somewhere, yeah. I know I have a copy somewhere, yeah.
But inside it...
Doorstep of a book.
Exactly. But inside it is this. So does this provoke any...
Oh yeah, Charlie's song.
Does that give you any memories or...
Oh yeah.
The lyrics are on the back.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a word.
Rise and follow Charlie.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember it well.
So I presume, I haven't listened to that, but is it some kind of a country and western type thing, or...
It's more of a kind of Kamalia, you know?
Right.
It's not really country. It's not a bad song at all. It's very, very rousing. You know, it's a Charlie song we'll sing. It's a bit like that. Or it's maybe even like a rebel song. Charlie song. We rise and follow Charlie. That's the vibe, you know. And hail the hail the leader, hail the man. With freedom's call all began, with Irish pride in every man. We'll rise and follow Charlie. Yeah. I mean, we used to love that. I mean, like, you see, various like Ireland, everything in terms of Irish politics was saturated with irony, like, which is an impossible thing to imagine now. It was all funny. Like we didn't take it for a minute seriously.
Really?
Yeah, it was all a big joke. That's why Driving the Crossroads became so popular, like, because I got the joke and I kind of conveyed the joke. I mean, I think of the story in that book about Brian Linehan ripping his suit like in Castlereagh, like, you know, and but it kind of he rescued himself from the humiliation. What happened was there was a big lorry up in the square in Castlereagh, and Fianna Fáil were having a rally, and the minister was coming to come down, you know, and he Swedes up in the car, like, and he's wearing the mohair suit, like, you know, and he waves to everybody and up on the stage, and you know, so he's there, and he speaks. I think I can't remember now, but then he's down, and there's one of those stacked chairs, you know, there, and the chair goes from under him, right, and he rips the arse out of his suit, like, you know. But like, in fairness to Brian, he got up and he pulled himself together, and he just went up to the microphone. He says, "I hope this doesn't mean I'm going to lose my seat in the Dáil." You know, so like that, you know, like the thing about Charlie Haughey then, like, and he's quoting Shakespeare and Vincent Brown going at him, you know. I mean, all that, like, it's you know, like, we had such laughs, like, I mean, we weren't laughing at them somehow, you know what I mean? In a way we were, but they were laughing too, you know.
Right.
You know, it was a funny, strange thing, and that's gone from Irish culture now.
It was described to me, I'm sure you've heard this dichotomy, Oisin Smith, who you may be familiar with, the Green Party, he was a TD in the last Dáil.
Yeah.
I was with him in 2016, and he was telling me that he had this, in his estimation, it was this very clear battle of good and evil, where it was like Gareth Fitzgerald was the good guy and Charlie Haughey was the bad guy.
Bullshit.
Now, I wasn't expecting you to maybe agree with that, but what is there anything to that? Was there an earnest?
Oh yeah,
was there an earnest? Earnestness about Fitzgerald.
Oh, there was. Yeah, that was the narrative.
Right.
Like, that's John Healy, the journalist. He christened Gareth Fitzgerald Gareth the Good. You know, and Charlie Haughey was the great national bastard. You know, like that, and again, that's kind of something. It's like a different era, but it wasn't true, of course, because Charlie Haughey wasn't a wicked man. You know, he was a bit of a mischief maker, and he pulled a few strokes. But most of the money, if he got money, and he did, but he got it not through doing anybody any favors. He got it because he was such a fucking, like, royal kind of figure, you know, that people like men like Ben Dunn actually fell in love with Charlie Haughey.
Yeah.
Literally fell in love with him. They were and they were terrified of him. You know, I remember I just wrote about it one time, the 1987 election, you know, and he's going on a tour for the election, you know, and I was around, and so the child, you know, there was balloons being given out, but they ran out, and the child was crying, and there's no balloons left, and Charlie said, "Balloons now! I want balloons, balloons." You know, and that was where he was. Everybody runs in every direction looking for fucking balloons, you know. You know the famous thing about Don Lydon, the psychiatrist. He when he was a senator, and he did something or said something, and Haughey called him in and gave him a looking bollocking, you know, and he said, "Go on, fuck off now," you know, and he was a grown man, an eminent psychiatrist, like, fuck off now, and Lydon went around, and then but the door had closed. He closed the door behind, and then he realised that it was all panelled walls, and you couldn't tell where the door was, and he was fucking, and Charlie was right, and he looks at him, says, "Jump out the fucking window." These are legends, like, and you know. But now it's just toxicity. It's just very funny. See, that's the thing. I have that thing about Driving at the Crossroads, that I almost feel guilty about it now, that it sanitizes politics in a way that is now completely unacceptable. Do you know what I mean? Like,
so that looseness.
Yeah, because like Doherty, the real thing about Driving the Crossroads, I mean, people didn't understand it. They didn't know how this is complex. They understood it at an emotional level. They understood because that's what made the book. This is what made the book work. The book is actually a love story about the relationship between myself and my father, which was a fraught relationship, and you know, he was 50 years older, so we were fighting a lot all the time, but still, you know. And it's about the language of politics being the language of our relationship. And there's a moment in the book where the book is kind of what you would call the denouement of the book. And that's the moment when, in this election, in 87, my father is on his last legs. He died 2 years later, very frail. I bring him to the polling booth. And he goes in and he's delighted meeting people and all that. And then I bring him out and put him in the car. And I look at him and he says, I voted for Doherty. And I said, so did I. You know, and that was the kind of moment when it all reconciled.
I remember I got a little bit emotional reading that bit.
Yeah.
It is very moving.
Yes, it is.
And your father wouldn't have been a Fianna Fáil man.
No, he had come on a journey. He was
Yes.
a blue shirt. Like,
Exactly.
You know, so something drew him to Haughey, and it was precisely Haughey's spirit and his fuck you attitude. Even though my father would never say the word fuck in his life, like, but he just thought, and the way he was being attacked all the time, he saw through all that. It's funny, you know, he just felt it. It's very like, you know, and this turned out to be so prophetic, it's not related, like, but when Roisin, my daughter, was only about 9 or 10, you know, I remember about Nixon. The Frost-Nixon movie came out, and you know, we hadn't seen it, but we went to a Harry Potter movie around the same time, and there was a trailer for it in the middle, and there was that famous thing where Frost says to Nixon, "Are you saying, Mr. President, that you didn't do anything illegal?" No, he said, "I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is when the president does something, it cannot be illegal." And Roisin after said, "Is that true?" And I said, "Well, actually, in a sense, it is true. Yeah, in certain circumstances, it is true for security and all that." And so she was fascinated with Nixon then. So a couple of days later, I came across a cover. I think it was the Daily Mail or something. And it had a free CD of the real actual Frost-Nixon interviews, and I got it, and we watched it together. And it was actually very powerful, like, I mean, you know, and in that same way, you know. And at the end I said to her, "What do you think?" And she said, "I think he was innocent." And actually that turned out to be true. I was only telling her recently. It was a CIA psyop. He was taken out. The whole Watergate thing was set up. None of it, it was a complete setup. And including the journalists set up, the Washington Post, the whole thing. They did it to take Nixon out. And so she picked that up, you know. And I picked it, and you know, and you pick it up in the Frost-Nixon movie, because he doesn't come across as a villain, you know, and that's right. So my point is, the point I'm making is about your friend Oisin. Like, I always say about O'Toole, I wrote this several times, Fenton O'Toole, you know. Isn't it amazing that Fenton O'Toole, who's a drama critic, can do like an amazing analysis of King Lear or Iago or Hamlet and all their flaws and all their shortcomings and all their dark sides. But when he fucking writes about Charlie Haughey, it turns into a member of the Workers' Party. You know? He loses all his capacity to see the complexity of the character. And like I was more interested in seeing the complexity of Charlie Hoy than I was interested in the complexity of King Lear. Always, you know, this is real life. Let's do it here, not in a fictional context, which is fine as well, because that's in a way how we learned it, in a way, to actually see these stories for what Trump is the same.
It's a mythical figure.
Yeah, it's an amazing figure. Like this is history in its most flamboyant sense. When Trump is like, I mean, you know, he's a phenomenon. He's the most extraordinary character that has emerged in world politics for decades. And all these guys can do is moralize about him, like on very little basis actually, except he said some crude things about women or something, or, you know. But he doesn't mind. He keeps saying them, man. He says the most appalling things, like, but it's actually funny. You see the thing, the one where he was in the witness, when he was that rape trial, which is a complete scam. You know, where he was supposed to have raped this woman in a drapery shop or something in the changing room. You know, that he met her in there and he couldn't. And he said, no, I didn't even fucking like her, you know. But in the witness box, her lawyer said to Mr. Trump, you know, he said, you said about my client, you made the most outrageous statement about her, saying that you did not find her attractive. And Trump says, well, you know, he says, I wouldn't fancy you either. He said, I would have no interest in you. In the court, like, fuck's sake, who would do that? What a hero. You know, so he's looking for, and the one he did about fucking to Micheál Martin was classic as well. You see that one? He says, he's talking to somebody, asked him, well, who's your favourite Irish man? Of course, it's a setup. And he said, who's your favourite Irish person? Your fighter. And somebody says, Conor McGregor. Conor's a great fighter. Says, and then he turned to Martin and says, and your father was a fighter too, wasn't he? And Martin says, oh yeah. Walking straight in. Says, yeah, look at you, so smooth and so handsome. He's just deadly. I said to you, do not ever take Trump on in a sparring match. He'll destroy you.
No, you're going to lose.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to the Gulf War, because that's where you start in the book.
Oh yeah, that's the first Gulf War, yeah.
And because I never hear about the Gulf War, right? But you say here, for all we really knew, there might not have been a war on at all, but simply an enormous simulation of war on television. So in my memory, or in my exposure, no one ever discusses that war. But you describe how its coverage was absolutely everywhere. It was all over the place. And there was just so much of the coverage of that war. So if both of those things are correct, possibly two things followed. Number one, the unreality of the war in terms of its effect on people in the West. But also you have the effects of the media coverage of that war on people's minds.
Yeah.
So were they desensitized by that coverage in a particular way that might have become a norm with the coverage and discussion of subsequent issues and conflicts? So I don't know, is it true to say no one talks about the war? But maybe it's not fair to talk about that because we're in Ireland, you know, but there seems to be an incoherence between the level of coverage that you describe and the consciousness of it now.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to explore why is there not a correlation there?
That war was the most extraordinary war I've ever seen or ever heard of. And I remember it so clearly. You know, like people were literally going home from work and they were filling up, getting takeaways, you know, beer and I think to go and watch the war for the night, like, because there was all this kind of, the Scud missiles, you know, and these missiles that could go around corners, and it was like some kind of fabrication. Really, it wasn't real at all. It was some kind of fantasy,
like a video game or something.
Like a movie that went on almost serial every day, every night for I don't know how long it went for, but it was quite a while. And there was this sense that it was the bad guys and the good guys very much, you know, the Americans were the good guys, and the Iraqis were the bad guys, and they had all these, you know, as I remember talking, you know, to Paul Morley. I did an article for the Irish Times about, for one of those front of the weekender, big, you know, 3,000 words or something about that. And like I remember talking to Paul Morley, who's a British journalist and brilliant music journalist that I loved when I was younger, you know, and he was a TV critic at the time, and he says they all have those unfortunate mustaches, the Iraqis, you know, so they become bad guys by just the way they look.
Like in your Clint Eastwood films.
Yeah. It's like a spaghetti western, and it was that kind of vibe, you know. So it was completely artificial. It felt completely artificial.
So even back then, it didn't feel real. Okay,
no,
so
didn't feel real at all.
Okay.
Like, and it was certainly nothing like the second Iraq war was entirely different. That was like a real war, but that wasn't. First war didn't feel real. I mean, it lasted a very short amount of time, and you know, that was the sort of that was Kuwait. It was the battle for Kuwait. But it was quite surreal, and I mean, at the time we didn't have anything to compare it to. Now people have forgotten it in a funny way, but it's actually of a piece with more what's happened in the world in the last decade, you know, than anything that was happening back then, or even for a long time afterwards. Well, I suppose 9/11 was another episode, but that felt absolutely real when it was happening, and so. You know, and I didn't tune into any kind of, I didn't really give any weight to the idea that 9/11 could have been a setup. I was too involved in it emotionally for all kinds of reasons. So that at the time, but so that the first Gulf War still stands out as some kind of extraordinary, you know, piece of theatre that they constructed for whatever reason.
I'm going to stay on that and a couple of things about memory. I'm quoting you here from Race of Angels. After a decade or so of McLuhan's global village, experts and critics had begun warning about an impending meltdown in our emotional reactions as a result of watching too much television. First, television would attack our attention spans, our concentration, even the human memory. At a more advanced stage, the mind, addled by television, would be incapable of retaining information for any significant period of time, but would function in much the same way as an electronic echo unit, constantly picking things up, regurgitating them once and wiping them forever. In the final stages, we would find ourselves increasingly unable to distinguish between fiction and reality.
I had forgotten that. I remember it now. That's an extraordinary description of what happened in the last 5 years in the world, you know, and the way that the media have been able to basically, you know, wipe the blackboard, as it were, every night, and then create a new reality next day, or restore. They could actually wipe a reality, replace it, then wipe the replacement and restore the original reality in a matter of days, and everybody would just go, that's fine, that's what's real now. Yeah, that is, I mean, that sounds far-fetched, but that's actually the way I saw it. I saw it numerous times in the COVID thing. You know, I remember that famously there was a time when in Ireland here, like in July I think of 2020, the total death toll from COVID was said to be 1,760 deaths, and they were like, that was on the basis of PCR test, nothing else. So the real figure was probably, let's say, 0. You know, but HICWA, who were the kind of investigative unit of the health services who looked into, did investigations into various aspects, they did a survey of the deaths and they went over them, and they came up with a new figure, which was just over 1,000, and they announced that the 760 was like too many, you know, and they said, so that was published and reported in the, as far as I don't watch TV, or I wasn't then, but in the papers and things, and it was reported that they'd done this, and they even, like the Taoiseach at the time, Radker, he actually referred to it in the Dáil and so on, and okay, right, that's done. So that's, you say, okay, there you are.
That's a new figure.
That's a new figure. 2 days later, they were back to the 1760 figure again, and that figure continued to be built on. So there's somewhere out there, I haven't looked at it for a long time, but there is somewhere out there a website which is still keeping count of COVID deaths, and the figure that's out there now is the descendant of the 1760, not of the 1,000 that Hickwa found. So in other words, it doesn't matter what the facts are, they just keep telling you the lie, and that the lie becomes the truth, and you can't argue with the truth. So, in a way, it's very interesting you bring that up, because that was kind of that episode in 1991, was it, or two? The first Gulf War. That was really, so you could say that was the beginning of the era we're now in the midst of, where reality has been abolished, if I may say so, and the reality is whatever they want it to be on any given day, and like that event stands out. It's strange. It's like a strange, surreal episode in the distant past that had no correlation to anything around it, and then it stopped, and it didn't go on like that. It just stopped and didn't start again for years and years and years. But it was like, yeah, that works. That was a good rehearsal. Yeah, I think that we can use that again.
And it probably had to be something that was removed from the place itself, because obviously, if they were talking about something happening in the country they were reporting to, people could have measured it against their own experience,
Yeah.
But if it's far away, obviously, you can't test it, like.
Yeah, but it did involve everybody in a way that I'd never seen before with current affairs. Like, it was almost like the World Cup. Now, this sounds very bad, comparison. It was like the World Cup was on, and everybody was going home early, or to go home and bringing some beer and popcorn and back to watch the match. And that was the way they were treating that war, and that's the way it was presented. I think Tariq Ali was the guy. He was the Iraqi Minister for Foreign Affairs or something like that, and he was this kind of figure. He was kind of like a comical figure, and I don't know, maybe I have his name wrong, but he was so funny, and everybody, he became a legendary figure in comedians, and like, were taking him off and all that, like, absolutely strange, but it just shows you, it tells you something, I think, of the way things were being planned, and also of where things are going to go. That in a way that we're going to go deeper into this sense of unreality, and ultimately nobody will be able to tell fact from fiction. And that was long before the deep fakes phenomenon came on board, where now you have a situation where people can actually, like we saw recently when they had that spat on the airplane between Macron and his wife or whatever, and like within hours, like there are like these videos going around which have them wrestling on the floor and him pulling her wig off, and and it looks so realistic. So like, how are we going to know? People say, well, okay, this is going to mean that they can set people up and they can do it. I think no, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that they won't be able to tell us anything about what is real, because we won't believe it. There's no reason to believe anything anymore, because anything can be faked, and that's something that I think it's unimaginable. I mean, we have taken for granted in our lifetimes. We have taken for granted that things happen in the public world. They get reported. People think about them. They talk about them, and then things happen, there are consequences and so on, or they have elections and the government gets voted out or whatever, But none of that will follow in a world such as we're thinking of here, describing here, because there's no point. There are no consequences for anything. There is no credibility for anything. It's just all entertainment. And if everything is entertainment, well, there's no reality, and therefore, it's a very dangerous place, to say the least of it.
In a way, it might bring back people to that physical reality that you're always talking about. Like maybe people will just switch off.
Yeah.
From all those mediums.
I think they will have to. More and more people, the world will have to treat them as if they were actually dangerous things, or something like, I don't know, obsolete things that we can't go there anymore. That we got to go back and read books, or
exactly.
We've got to have meetings in our houses and talk, and rambling houses maybe, or who knows, like.
I have something here on that. So Umberto Eco, did I say his name correctly?
Yeah.
In Travels in Hyperreality, you talk about him in the book. You say, the battle for survival, he argues, is not to be won where the communication originates, but where it arrives. This implies, he concludes, a guerrilla solution, which he defines as the patrol and subversion of media by other media. In the modern age, he suggests, it is the function of the non-industrial forms of communication to assist in the restoration of a critical dimension where presently there is only passivity. As examples of these forms, he mentions love-ins and student rallies. That particular essay was written in 1967. In another essay written 16 years later, he didn't know how right he had been. Contemplating a little more pessimistically the heightened barrage of what he now calls the media squared, he notes despairingly, power is elusive, and there is no longer any telling where the plan comes from, because there is, of course, a plan, but it is no longer intentional, and therefore it can no longer be criticized with the traditional criticism of intentions. There is no longer virtue and guilt, no longer anyone to blame, except perhaps ourselves or something inside ourselves. We have to start again from the beginning, asking one another what's going on.
Wow. Yeah, I remember that now. Yeah. Brilliant. So real now. Everything he says there is exactly the world we find ourselves in.
But you do see that with the alternative media. I know it looks still quite unsophisticated and doesn't have that authority of the established media or whatever, but you are seeing that kind of scrutiny.
It's kind of riding shotgun on what the other media is doing, or if that's the right phrase. It's not, but it's kind of policing in its own way the mainstream media, and is shaming it and calling it out in a way that grows louder, for sure. Some of the style of it and the content, it can be shambolic, it can be quite excellent in some respects, but it's chaotic and
anarchistic or something.
It is anarchistic. Yeah, it's anarchy, media anarchy. And I mean, this is the funny thing. The real funny thing is that these corrupt mainstream journalists still feel superior to this media because they're so sophisticated and polished. But what they actually mean by, what actually that reads as, to my eyes now, is when I see professional media as a compare, I can see the makeup. I can see it's like somebody's kind of put a magnifying glass on it, and you can see all the artificiality of it, including in the way they speak, the way they kind of rehearse ways that they do scripts, the way the weather forecast. The weather forecasters always put the emphasis on the wrong syllables when they're doing. I don't know why they do that, but that's somebody came up with that as a way of doing the weather, and and all this artificiality. It's now becoming like grotesque. In a certain sense, it's almost like drag. It's like a man pretending to be a woman. It's like you can see that it's an ugly man who's in there, and that the makeup has from a distance looks like a beautiful woman, but the closer you get, the uglier it gets. And I think that's a really prescient quotation. Like Echo was a really brilliant guy. He's amazing. And this is the thing. There's nobody like that I know of now, except maybe Zizek or somebody like that. And he's coming from a particular kind of position, and it's, I like him a lot, actually.
Is Desmond in another world entirely, or?
I think so. Yeah, he's a specialist in this, and he's a very serious kind of, he's a clinician and he's a diagnostician, whereas Umberto was an observer, really dispassionate in a way, and just sort of analysing events, whereas Desmet is going after this particular thing, mass formation, psychosis, if you can add that word. He doesn't actually. People say he had, but he hasn't. He always says you can't attribute to the collective any kind of pathology that is individual. That's a mistake. It's too much of a leap. But but these guys were, they were so good. These culture critics, and I cite a lot of them in the introduction to that book, because I'm trying to set up the Race of Angels, because I'm trying to set up, what might be the mission of an artist or a rock band, which is a form of artist, a collective artist. What might be the mission of an artist like this in this age that we, in a certain sense, seem to be beginning now? When I read this book was 1994. It published in 94, so I was writing it in 93, and it was a very interesting process. Like one of the key figures in the book was Mike Cooley, this industrial philosopher and designer of computers. He did a lot of work for the Japanese when they were the market leaders in computer manufacture. And I spent a lot of time talking to him, before I started writing, and then I lost touch with him, and I meant to keep coming back and interview him. And I almost in the end didn't get to him, because the deadline was encroaching, and then I was almost in the last chapter ready to send it off, and my phone rang, landline, and I picked it up, and it was Mike. And I said, "Oh, I've been avoiding you." But I then did this amazing interview with him when it was in the book. And actually, there's a chapter in there which it's called Shape of an Angel. And that one is like The Shape of an Angel. That's the one where it's all about him. And he describes in it, the whole nature of the different ways that art can be seen in culture, that it can be seen as something contrived and coming from the creative person. But it's another is the way that the object, the piece of the slab, as he says, slab. He talks about his father taking him to a stonemason in Tuam and to buy a gravestone for his grandmother. And it's I'll read a bit of it because it's so beautiful, so the stonemason says to him, says, "Do you want a cross?" And Mike says, "No, had my father said he wanted a cross, he would have then described all the different kinds of crosses he could have had. But my father said, well, no, I was thinking of a figure." So he said, "Well, what about Christ with a crown of thorns?" And my father looked a bit shocked by that, because some of those figures were quite grotesque. And he said, "Well, no, not exactly that." And he said, "Well, what about the mother and child?" "Not really." And then he said, "An angel." And my father said, "Oh, well, yes, an angel." And he said, "Well, would you like the angel looking sad down at the grave?" And he held his hands in a very differential way and looked down towards the ground. And my father said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, what about looking up to heaven?" And he held his hands together now higher than before, almost at his face level, and looked up towards the sky. And my father said, yes, something like that. And he said, "Would you like the wings outstretched?" And he spread his arms out behind him. My father said, yes, he would. that was a total description that was given. The only quantification, the only attempt to give a sense of scale was when he was leaving. We were leaving, the stonemason said, "I'll make it about as big as myself." And sure enough, the figure was about the same size. He was able to call up a whole set of images in my father's mind. They were communicating at the level of language and image with a very, very shared perception of what they were talking about, which can only come when you are deeply immersed in a community and in a culture. Like, that's one of the most brilliant expositions of what a culture is, I think, and how it works, you know, in one's thing. And it goes on then about the way that different things mean different things to different people and so on. But the meaning of that is that there's a different, you know, the culture that we're it's not something, you know, creativity is more than just sort of pulling things out of your head, you know. It's out there, it's there, it's something you tune into and you belong to, and it's visible or audible or both, and but you need to work on it, and you know, when you think about it, going back to the introductory thing about the television and all that, I mean, television has been a hugely destructive force in the world because it's such a passive way of engaging with reality. You're not doing anything, you're just, you know, it's like there's no engagement really other than you're just absorbing this information.
There is a phrase, I think, in the book, tune in to tune out.
Yeah.
Like you watch it in order to wind down.
Yeah.
And that obviously presupposes that you're not really tuned in.
So, you know, when you go into this, Fergus, I mean, when you go into this, then you start to think again about what were the mysteries of the last few years, about why people behaved in certain ways, so docile, so subservient, so muted. That's the explanation. There's no mystery. You know, they were just dumbed down and rendered almost hypnotized already by the television. I used to feel around here, you know, I would, during the early stages of the lockdown at night time, I would walk out around the street, you know, just after dark, and all the windows would have no curtains, most of them anyway, and the TV set would be on, and there were people gathered in the room staring at this thing, and the same faces every night, you know, Houlihan and all that, you know, those guys, you know, with their charts and their, you know, going through the death figures for the day, like, you know. And there was a book came out there called, I can't remember now what the author is, it's an American doctor, it's very good, and he talked about that particular moment at night. The purpose of that, he said, was, I wish I could remember his name now, but it'll come back to me, that when people are tired in the evening, he said, and you present them with difficult propositions or things they have to take in, details, he says that's extraordinarily tiring and very hard on the brain, because he says what actually happens is that you're so tired you haven't got any energy and to absorb in the normal way. So what you're actually doing is you're erasing your memories in order to make space for this new information because of the tiredness. And this is really, I think, and then he says that when you erase, you do that. And what's actually happening, he says, in all this process is that people's memories are being replaced by narrative. So you don't any longer remember what the country was like when you grew up, but you can remember, you know, how many people died of COVID.
That's obviously a narrative in a specific sense.
Yes, it is a narrative. Yeah,
rather than the broader use of narrative.
It means in the sense of what they want you to believe, the narrative that they are selling you. That's the version of reality. Again, it's part of the meaning of my new book, The Abolition of Reality, which is like that's what they're doing. They're erasing reality, and they're replacing it with this new narrative. And all that is implicit in that opening chapter, you know, in Race of Angels, you know, because I always had this idea that This book, first of all, just to kind of introduce, because we've kind of jumped straight into it without really introducing it. Race of Angels, Ireland and the Genesis of U2. It was my second book. It's a book I want to write because I wanted to understand Ireland in culture terms. And is there a unique kind of genius in a people that can survive through time and resurface at various junctures and metamorphise into different forms, idioms, as time passes. So therefore, there's a chapter in there which is about medieval. It's based on Daniel Corkery's book, The Hidden Ireland, and the poets of the Middle Ages, the Irish poets. And I do an exercise where I take a poem by a guy called Andreas McGrath, who may have been a relation of mine, because my mother's side was McGrath, and I compare that to the U2 song "The Wanderer," or the song that they wrote for Johnny Cash, and there's almost line for line identical, even though none of them ever heard of this guy Andreas McGrath. Like, now, that's a very tenuous, a very almost mad thing to do, but it's so extraordinary that once you've done the exercise and you've read it, you can't dismiss it completely. So it leaves open the possibility that there is some kind of, germ of consciousness that explodes and goes, like, because there's another metaphor in the book, and you two are in it only as an emblem of this and a way of telling this story. It could have been anything, but there's an emblem in it. There's a metaphor in it in relation to rivers, underground rivers.
Yes.
That they lived in this strange place out in Glasnevin and Finglas and all that. And that's where they were kind of growing up, and that had been a rural area, and had loads of rivers, and some of them were underground, and some of them were built over when they built the housing estates, right? And there were incidents of like people sitting in their living rooms, and the river would burst up through the floorboards. That happened on more than a few occasions, and that seemed to me to be an extraordinary metaphor of what I was looking for. That here was the culture saying, "I'm still here. I'm here. I'm not going away. I'm going to find a way of bursting out and expressing what needs to be said," and so that was kind of one of the ideas. The meaning of the title, just to get out of the way, comes from a quote from the Franz Fanon, the Caribbean psychiatrist who worked in Algeria during the civil war there in the late 50s, early 60s, that kind of time. And he did a number of books about postcolonialism. He was a Marxist, but people think that some people either think that's the best thing ever, or they think it's kind of disqualifies him from being an objective observer. He was an extraordinarily objective observer. His Marxism didn't really intrude on his work. He was, except in the sense that he was revolutionary also. And he believed that colonialism had imposed an extraordinary psychological damage on people. And he found that when he was working as a psychiatrist. And another of his books was called Black Skin, White Masks. And that's the idea of the black people being forced to become like the white people, and to imitate them. That's the syndrome of colonialism. And so the chapter I use is the title I use for that when I talk, because everything that he was saying seemed to me to be utterly true of Ireland and the Irish. And I said the title of the chapter is that I use is White Skin, White Masks, because that's a real head wrecker, because you're now imitating somebody who looks the same as yourself, but is actually quite different, and that's an even double. It's even a double whammy, psychologically. So I became interested in all this stuff when I read Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is one of the most amazing books I've ever read, because it's all about Ireland, even though he doesn't mention Ireland. You know, it's all about the way we are and our culture, what happened to it, the truncation of culture. You know how you must. The only way that is you can ever free yourself, Fanon says, is you must tear yourself away from the colonizer, and eschew everything he stands for. And of course, we never did that. And yet, there's this paradox that the underground river, that the culture has been truncated and it's gone underground, but you don't know where it is, and you don't know where it's going to come out again. And so you have to imagine your culture back into reality, on whatever tenuous clues are left. And that's never been done in Ireland either. Because you see, the big problem with a post-colonial culture is that, like in Ireland we had the de-Anglicisation, the Gaelic League and, Douglas Hyde and all that, which is and that became almost like a war all of itself, not that they necessarily fought that war, but that others, and particularly I think priests and so on, this idea that you had to purge Ireland of every English trace. But of course that's impossible. If you've gone through an experience, you can't just simply jettison it. And I mean, I say that to people, when you talk about when we were kids, when we were growing up and going to school and everything, okay, we went to school and we learned Irish history and so on, and that was great. And we did love it, all those heroes and so on, but we read Enid Blyton, we read Agatha Christie, we read Billy Bunter, we read Just William, we read the Dandy and the Hotspur and the Hornet and the Victor, and the Bunty and the Judy, and the June and School Friend and Diana. And we watched TV, those of us who had TVs, and watched Top of the Pops. And we listened to the radio, John Peel and Whisper and Bob Harris. It was all English culture. And how do you decide that something that being Irish somehow it doesn't include that? That you can somehow create a track that's just Irish, that's just Gaelic. It's not possible. So there's so much, now you see that argument will be heard by certain people in a certain way as a justification of sort of multiculturalism. It's not. It's just a description of the reality of our consciousness as a consequence of colonialism. And we need to deal with that by way of conversation. But we've never talked about it. It's a thing you never hear talked about in Irish life. Never. It's the idea that Ireland is a post-colonial country. And people will actually blindly and blandly deny that it ever was. I've had that when I spoke in public very many times way back years ago. And you'd have some guy at the back say, Ireland was never a post-colonial. We're never a colonial country. We were part of the British Empire. Such nonsense. Colonialism is a psychological process in which there's a master and a slave. And we were in that relationship with the British Crown and its underlings. And nobody can deny it. And then, of course, you get into the genocidal aspects of it and so on. And all that needs to be talked about as well, because that never was either. Almost nobody, if you say today in any public place in Ireland where there are people that what are called the famines of the 1840s were actually genocides, somebody will attack you in public. So it's an outrageous suggestion. It's just nonsense. Our history is so screwed up, and as a result, our culture is screwed up, and our personality as a people is screwed up. And here we are now in the state we're in today. We're essentially giving our country away because we don't think we're worth having a country.
I'm going to stick with Fanon for a minute or two more. Kind of read a bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, do, yeah. If you can find that section about the race of angels, I don't know if where it
is. Yes, I have it here. Maybe, would you read it? Would that be good?
What page is it on there? Just
85.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. I'm talking here about intellectuals and about all the contradictions that come about in a post-colonial society, which can actually cause the damage to get worse if people don't know what they're doing or what they're talking about.
And that's the priest you were talking about.
Yeah,
this Father Devan.
Devan, yeah, who was
he overcorrects maybe.
He does, yeah, because he's ranting at Father Devan, yeah.
The influence of jazz, and that's on the next page. But
yeah,
it actually leads right into.
Well, no, he says it's actually on the page before. He says it is now sad to look back on those halcyon days and to see the blight of the Civil War and the fratricidal strife that followed in its wake. Gone is the idealism, gone the mysticism, gone the messianism. They have been replaced by cynicism, fatalism and pessimism. Native music and song had given way to jazz, crooning and the dances of African primitives. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, baby. So now he says, and I go on then, I'll just read this section. In other words, there is at this point a danger of compounding the original wrong done by colonialism. The colonial mentality required a denial of the validity of certain aspects of the native personality, which in our case would have been called Irish, and had to, whatever extent, supplanted them with elements of what might be called perhaps English or British. Now we were being asked to make a further denial, to deny those elements which, for all that had been forced upon us, were inescapably now part of what we were. Paul Durkin, writing about Van Morrison, has referred to the Englishness which is an essential ingredient of the Irishness of Morrison's music. His song, Summertime in England, is, writes Durkin, an Irishman's hymn to the Englishness that is in us all, if we care to look inside ourselves, which of course so many of us don't. And then I say, the dialectic rears its interesting head. We should not be too critical of those who, out of excessive zeal or grief, sought to extinguish all those elements which they regarded as being alien to themselves. Neither is Fanon. There is a need for tearing away. But this could not, in the Irish case, refer to a tearing away from England and all she stood for, but rather from the slavish imitation of all she stood for, while hating her all the while. The tearing away would occur in the mind of the colonised, in negating the inferiority which the native felt towards his own culture. It would paradoxically enable him to re-enter the world and embrace his former master as a full human being. This tearing away, writes Fanon, painful and difficult though it may be, cannot be escaped. And he says, if it is not accomplished, there will be serious psychoaffective injuries, and the result will be individuals without an anchor, without a horizon, colourless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels. That's it. That we're floating over the world, over the earth. We have no roots. We're lost in space, and that explains everything about what's happening now in contemporary Ireland in relation to what is essentially our handing over of our country to foreigners, and a sense that really we will end up, the Irish race will be either nomadic in the future or will die out very quickly. That's almost inevitable now, unless, and you know, I always say that, but I say, well, what if there are no unlesses? Where are we going to find the unlesses? Who's going to be the unless? Who's going to be the cavalry coming over the hill? Is Clint Eastwood going to come and save us? John Wayne? I don't know.
Brian Boru, yeah. He could, maybe. Maybe he'll pop up to the floorboards one day. But we're going to have to find something, because that this condition is untreated and it's unrecognised, and it is at the back of everything. It's at the back of this personality of the Irish, which is very like something I learned in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is to do with the personality of the alcoholic, which is contradictory, paradoxical. And the way they describe it is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. That's the Irish personality. Because, you know, that when you hear all these politicians prating about, so we're a very self-confident nation now, we're very outlooking and liberal and progressive in our outlook, no, we're not. We're pretending to be. We have no self-confidence as a nation, because we never actually got to the roots of the problem. We still have to do that. And I've been talking about this now for nearly 40 years, and nobody listens, because they think that this, for a long time it was like, we have to leave all that old stuff behind us, move on. No, you can't move on until you've sorted out your mess. And we never did.
So that's kind of what I was getting at in the book overall, is I was trying to get to the bottom of this. And you too seem to me to be an expression of that at the time, of, you know, a new voice in a new medium, relatively, you know, and taking on the world and conquering the world with it. And the idea that I had was, because at the time, you know, people, their general attitude to U2 was in Ireland, was kind of one of complete wonderment. You know, that they kind of started off as a band in Dublin, and nobody really took much notice of them. Then they went to America, and suddenly we woke up one day and they were being described as the biggest band in the world. And, you know, of course, we being Irish and having that inferiority complex, we're delighted by this. Like, and, you know, just like, you know, the whole idea, like, you know, if there's two flies climbing up a mirror and one of them is Irish, then we're up for that fella, you know. And it doesn't matter where it's happening. But so this idea came, oh, they're Irish. Whoa, great, yeah. But it was kind of like, they're the biggest band in the world despite being Irish, you know. And I was saying, what if it's because they're Irish? Maybe that's why it is. And it was. And that's what I wanted to answer. Like, what is it about them that makes them so appealing? What is it people are hearing? That Irish thing. And you can still feel this thing, this kind of, this trope or this message that you hear all the time, particularly from America, that they talk almost in kind of reverent terms about Ireland because it has something special. And they don't know what it is, and they can't describe it except in cliches. But they know it's deeper than any of that. And they're right. But we don't, in Ireland, respect it. We kind of think that's all those hat stuff, you know. I know, you know, diddly-eye music and stuff like that, you know. No, we've moved on now, you know. But U2, it was never about that, you know. Or now, it's a complicated story because, you know, the problem with it is, though, that, you know, the book, as it moves through its argument, comes to the whole idea of the modern incarnation of colonialism, which I kind of see as corporatism at the time, 93, 94. The corporations taking over the world. And what I kind of am hopeful about is that the experience of colonialism will have in some sense inoculated us against this, or at least made us aware of the symptoms, and that therefore we will be in a certain sense immune from this condition.
This is things like the double speak.
Yes.
How the subversive use of language.
Yes. And
that kind of thing.
That and the idea that you would give up your freedom for something else. You know, that you could be persuaded to actually give away something as precious as your right to personal autonomy and sovereignty by the promise of something, or, you know, technological baubles, or, you know, money even, you know, that, you know, like in Ireland, it's a different story, but I had long been talking about this thing, and I still do. The famous speech by De Valera in 1943, because it's called the dream speech in one sense, but it's also called, pejoratively, the comely maidens dancing at the crossroads speech. Now, 30 years ago, I wrote about this and pointed out, and I was the first to do it. Although there's a thing in Wikipedia about this, and it actually implies that I was on the other side. I wasn't. I was talking about this before anybody did, pointing out that De Valera didn't use the word comely. He didn't mention dancing, and he didn't mention crossroads.
And part of the problem was the transcript, which he had changed.
Yeah, he looked, somebody gave him a speech with the word comely in it, and he crossed it out and put in happy. Now, I don't think there can be any objection to him wanting women to be happy. You know, we all try, that's what we're all about, isn't it? You know, so, but see, that was a caricature that was created in order to use that as a propellant of a liberal agenda, a modernising agenda, but actually get the core of his speech. His speech was actually about the Irish language, actually, but that's all forgotten. But at the core of it was this idea, this beautiful idea, this, you know, this Ireland which we dreamed of, you know, where of athletic youths and beautiful women and children playing in the fields and a little, you know, cozy homesteads, you know, and like, who wouldn't want this? Like, you know, and yet we don't. We turned away from that. We wanted big Georgian mansions out in the middle of a field, you know, instead. And there's a real message there, because he was really talking not about bare subsistence. He was talking about what does it take to make a human being happy. If we can get to that, won't that be enough, you know? And the strange thing, many years after that, a guy called Easterlin came up with a thing called in economics called the Easterlin paradox, which was that very idea that, you know, in the terms of the relationship between money and happiness, that yes, a certain amount of money will bring you, say, to that level of happiness. But if you want to go another bit, it'll take that much more money. So the more happiness and it isn't really happiness anyway. So that, in other words, you can get basic level of happiness and contentment with low expectations and relatively little money. But we abandoned that. And I remember actually, I used to talk about this, and I remember once in 2009, after the crash, thinking, well, now we've seen, surely. I remember being down in Leixlip speaking one night, and I said, I'll fly a kite here now, see how this goes down. Given this what's happened, this is like we're in a year into the meltdown of the economy and the blame, shame and name processes that were going on. So I said, you know, De Valera, I started talking about De Valera's dream speech, and you know, maybe that was time to re-examine what he was saying. Everybody went crazy, as if nothing had happened. Like, they still hadn't understood the message the lesson they'd been taught by the crash, that this is unsustainable, that what you need, you know, that the expectations are what's wrong, that you don't need this to be happy.
It's interesting that I don't remember, I was younger when that happened, you know, so I don't know if this accurate, but it's nearly like the real correction never really happened. Like you talked about in 1987, there's that clip of you on the soapbox on the Late Late.
Yeah.
And you're saying to cancel the debt, and maybe that just means starting from scratch. Yeah. Whereas in 2009, I presume people still had to pay back.
They did.
Do you know what I mean? So maybe it might have been different if there was like you say, one of our only hopes might be total economic collapse. Yeah. Because then from that point on, you actually start from the ground up. That maybe wasn't able to happen in 2009.
No, because you know there was
so we didn't have maybe the freedom to think. Yeah. How could we actually build this in a way that might be more conducive to human flourishing?
At that time, there was this sense of this shouldn't have happened. You know, this was a terrible thing that happened, and you know, it's like we just couldn't accept it, and therefore there was no lessons being learned, and the media coverage of it was all in the name, blame, and shame thing. You know, that was their agenda, and go after the bankers and go after it. But like, yeah, fine, go after the bankers, but what does that solve? You know, the point was that we'd been taken for a ride. We'd been told that you can, you know, that you can become prosperous without any visible means of support, you know, and that's what happened. I mean, there was no reason that Ireland should suddenly become a rich country. That was nonsense. You know, we became rich by, you know, important Polish builders to build houses for themselves, like, or something, you know, ridiculous. And nobody, you know, and it's happened again since. It's happened now in the last few years, even since the COVID thing. You can see all these Teslas. You forget. Yeah, you know, it's very important. You don't say Tesla. You see, Tesla. Yeah, this is vital. And you see all this now, and this is the same thing again. So, you know, we're going to have to go back for a third lesson, it seems. You know, but we won't be here is the problem for that one. At the rate, because the rate of our destruction is so rapid now. You know, the rate of the hemorrhaging of our young population, the rate of our taking in of other people's populations. You know, people find it incredible to think that this island might be called something other than Ireland before too long. But I'm telling you, that's what's going to happen, unless.
You, in your most recent Substack, it's very optimistic. I know every time I describe something you say it's imperfect, but anyway, I'll give it I'll try. I remember one day I used the word reductionist when I described something you'd read. But basically, in a sentence, you say, well, maybe is it our velvet revolution might be around the corner, or is that the word, or the spring, or there's some word, is velvet revolution the word?
Yes,
but
it
you
is.
have this, and it's amazing how, back to what we discussed at the very start, how some discussions are not perfectly is empirical. Is the word. There is an emotion in your writing which is novel, you know, in and there's an intuitive aspect to it massively. I think you can just see week to week, it's like your feelings really come out. You know?
Yeah, and I'm vacillating.
And in the most recent one, the feeling was, no, maybe something's going to happen. Well, I wonder how much of that was your experience in Galway. You had, what was a, by your description, a wonderful experience.
Yeah, in Charlie Burns' bookshop.
Maybe it was broader than that. I know you're taking so many things into the equation.
Well, you see, this is the thing, you know. Just to go into that a wee bit. I mean, when I wrote this book, for example, in 1994, like, I was speaking all over the country. I was a columnist in the Irish Times, and it was like more invitations than I could possibly fulfill. And so I could be out 3-4 nights a week in different towns in Ireland, like, and I would be in roomfuls of people, like several hundred people sometimes, talking about their country and, you know, what was happening in it and culture. This is like, you know, when things were getting better, I mean, economically. And then, you know, about a dozen years ago, I came under attack by the LGBT goons, who decided that I was too dangerous to leave lying around, so they decided to take me out, and they came after me. But they wouldn't have succeeded had not the Irish Times, which was employing me, ganged up along with them against me, and basically, I said, okay, I'm gone, and so I've spent the last 10 years in this kind of limbo where I can't speak anywhere in public, or I'll be attacked. Or they'll like, even last week in Tralee, the Sinn Féin, you know, members threatened to burn down a GAA centre if I was allowed to speak in it.
Wow!
Like, people think, you know, this is a free country. It's a completely banana republic.
How did they articulate that?
Well, very simply. I mean, there was one individual who kicked up. He was involved in some way in the premises and whatever. So he kicked up when he discovered I was being allowed to speak. This isn't the first time it happened. I mean, it happens all the time. It happened to me recently in a situation in Dalkey, where the owner of a venue for an event I'd been advertised for 3 weeks, 3 hours before, said, no, he's not going to speak here. I lived in Dalkey for 25 years, you know, like, you know, it's like I'm from a different planet because of propaganda. And again, we're back to what we were talking about at the beginning, you know, that sense of that you can erase everybody's consciousness of everything and replace it with lies, and they accept the lies. That's all they know now. So last week, I mean, well, the way it happened was that Charlie Burns' bookshop is the most beautiful, amazing bookshop in the country, really. Like, it's just a huge series of caverns, like, full of books, like, and
actual nooks and crannies.
Yeah. And the outside place is like a new book, pretty much all, not entirely exclusively, but it's mainly new books. And then you go in, and it's just like absolutely wonderland for anybody who likes books. The only place left that I know of, I'm sure there are other places, but it's the biggest and the best bookshop like that. You could spend the day in there. Like, you could go in the morning, and then you go out for your lunch and go back in again, and you still wouldn't have seen half of them, you know. And so, like, I went in there with a friend of mine last December. I was in Galway for a court case, and we decided we'd wander around into Charlie Burns, and there was a couple of people behind the counter there that I didn't recognise, but it turned out to be like staff members who knew about me. And I kind of, you see, I developed this sense in the last 10 years of being always kind of almost like, I won't say ashamed, but brittle about my own reputation. You know, I don't, so my name is John Waters. I don't tell anybody. Say, are you John Waters? No. Unless they know for sure. I don't tell. I say, no, I hate him. I say, oh, that guy, because I just don't. That's how bad it is, And like in the COVID period, I stopped making eye contact with people on the streets because of the hostility I was getting because of taking illegal action against the lockdowns and all that. So I kind of, I was a bit, wary about, but they recognised me and came over and started talking to me, and they were all like, "How are you doing? And are you not writing any books?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I am. Yeah, I've got a book coming out soon." And they said, "You have to launch it here." And I say, "Sure."
You know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, are you sure? And they said, yeah. Now I think it was a naivety on their part, because a lot of people don't know about that this is true. They don't know what's happening in their country.
It's funny, I've experienced this as well. There is a cohort of the population, it's impossible to tell who it is, but who does remember you from 2010. And that's their image of you. Oh, he's that fella who was an alcoholic and wrote those books about religion.
Yeah.
And a bit quirky and had the hair.
Yeah.
But there are some people who don't have that consciousness of all the things that have happened since.
There should be a generation out there who remember me from the 90s, but they're probably very old now, because they were older than me then, and they would have been like generally speaking, there would be people from 40s upwards, at that time. So like that's 30 years ago. So you can sort of,
yes,
so that's nature. But anyway, I said, yeah, okay. And so when the book came out, I contacted them again, and they seemed keen. They seemed, yeah. But I kept thinking all day. I mean, that Monday we were going down, and we came from Sligo over to Galway. It was absolutely, like, as I said, a car wash of a day. Like, it was absolutely spilling.
You said to wash the scum off the streets.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah, well, I meant to. It cleans up the streets. The way the street is so clean and it's fresh after rain. And then I got there, and then the chairs are set out there, and there was people buzzing around, and nobody was attacking me, and everybody was smiling and waving at me, and all this. Like, I says, what year is it? And I thought, even up to the very last, I thought there's going to be some kind of intervention, some intrusion, because that has happened before. But no, there wasn't. So we went ahead and we started talking about unspeakable things, like things that you're not allowed to speak about. We started at 6 o'clock, and we were still there at 9. Like, they said, it was the longest book launch they've ever had there, and probably the liveliest, because we were all, and then people were on the floor we weren't all in necessarily agreement about everything. Like, but I was saying things that I hadn't said ever in public, about what's in my book and so on. So it was like suddenly Ireland's free again. I remember that line from Pierce, which is, when we are free, very, resonant line, which I always I wanted to call it a book, like even a few years ago, before any of this started, I wanted to bring out a book called When We Are Free, because I knew we weren't, ever. And, but anyway, it was a fantastic night. I was absolutely dizzy, to be in a bookshop, a real bookshop, and shelves of books around you, and which is where I feel I kind of am entitled to be, and that I belong, because I've written 11 books, and I've had some place in the consciousness of my nation, and but that's all denied. It's been denied by all these people who have taken over our country, who now have the run of it, and who control all the institutions. Like, they've walked through the institutions. The march through the institutions has happened, and the judiciary has fallen, and the police have fallen, and the media have fallen, and the politicians have fallen, and the scientists have fallen, the doctors have fallen, and the church has fallen. So who's left? But still, we did it one night, and for that one night, I'm forever grateful to Charlie Burns. I don't care, in a sense, if it doesn't happen again, so be it. But it happened that night, so I'm thrilled about that. And what's happened to Ireland is really shocking. It's utterly shocking. It's run by the darkest forces imaginable, and some of the stupidest people on earth. Just because they're the ones that are most useful to the forces, because they don't even understand what they're doing. They have no sense of responsibility for what they're doing. They don't care. They have no love of Ireland. Like people like Radker, you know. I've repeatedly said it. He should never be allowed to be Taoiseach because he had no love of Ireland. There should be some kind of a test for somebody who goes to a position like that. Love of Ireland. I mean, if you go to Spain and you want to become a Spanish citizen, you have to study for several years and do a test. So you've learned the Spanish language, so that you know about Spanish history. You won't become a citizen without that. And we allow somebody to become a Taoiseach who doesn't care about Ireland, who is Ireland's enemy. And we let him into that office, let him run riot, and pretend that he's a normal person. And then it turns out he's not. Suddenly it's advantageous to become gay and weaponise that in his own interest, in his political interest, and in the interest of his paymasters. It's monstrous. People have no idea how monstrous the stuff that's happened in this last 10 years has been. Like the attacks on the Constitution in 2012, the children's so-called referendum, which basically stripped parents of all rights to protect their own children, and we see this now live and real in the trans thing, where the child can go to the state and get them to help them to overcome the objection of their parents. Marriage, parenting, family, all destroyed in the 2015 referendum, and then the fundamental right of the child, unborn child, overturned in 2018. And then, of course, the whole thing basically bulldozed again, just in case there was anything left standing in 2020. And the people are being conditioned then to regard someone like me who says, hang on, as the enemy. Like our enemies are doing this. And they think if you object to it, you're the enemy. You're the bad guy. It's bonkers. So it's a kind of, it's not a long way from this book, actually, because this book was, it was, it's, how will I put it? It's wrong, this book, ultimately. It got it wrong because it was naive and it was hopeful. It thought that the lesson would be learned, that it was still possible to educate ourselves about what had actually happened to us and to shake off those pathologies that Franz Fanon talked about. But instead they deepened, and as a result we basically came to the state where the only way we could show that we weren't savages was to give our country to savages who are now running riot around our cities, stabbing people, molesting people, abducting children. And we just sit there smiling, aren't we great? Aren't we great to be as good as we are? It's disgusting. But I got it wrong in that for one thing, I thought that U2 would be an example of something that would speak cogently out of that history and that experience. I mean, I gave Fanon's books to Bono. I bought a set of Fanon's books and gave them to Bono. I said, you got to read these. This is the most important. These are the most important books you're ever going to read about Ireland. And they're not about Ireland. And I don't think he ever read them. Because he's, look what's happened. You two have gone to the dark side. Like his friends are George Soros and Bill Gates. I can't think of two worse friends he could possibly have chosen in the entire world than those two guys. And even today, I don't think he understands that. So, U2 is a dead duck as far as Ireland is concerned. It's bizarre. I don't know how I could misjudge the situation so badly. Naivety at that time, idealism, hope, all these things to beguile you. So I'm at the same time I am very proud of this book because it describes the situation really well in a very compact way and condense and makes the cultural question really clear. That the strange paradox of having been colonised, is that you have to both reject the culture that's colonised you and yet in some way absorb it into yours and reinvent it as your own. And, when you watch this back to the 70s, I didn't even know about Fanon then, but there were bands then like say Planksty and Horselips, who were actually, whether unconsciously or not, I don't think entirely, because I know that Eamon Carr, the drummer in Horselips, was a brilliant guy, still is, who wrote a lot of poetry himself, and he knew about the great history of Ireland and the great poets and so on. And so he was kind of consciously doing this, which was to blend some kind of meld modern culture with the oldest culture. In some ways it came out really well, in some ways it kind of was a bit forced, but I think it was a really good experiment, Horselips in particular. But Planksty was more integrated, and it was really good as well. But the weird thing is that if you really want to think about that underground river going underground and going God knows where, and then we don't know where to find the mouth of it again, the person who kind of, probably single person who got it, who found that place more effectively and more adroitly than anyone else, is not an Irishman at all, and that's Bob Dylan. Because he basically borrowed Irish music and turned it into a new music for a new world in a new age. And there are some of his songs which are absolutely unbelievably Irish. Somewhat paradoxically, probably the most song that is a song called Boots of Spanish Leather. But if you listen to that song, all the intonations, all the language, it's Hiberno English. It's an Irishman that's speaking. And somehow he's internalized that voice. That's kind of that's what missing. And of course Shane MacGowan did it with that merging of punk and rebel songs and ballads really effectively. And I wrote, in one of my books, I wrote a tribute to Shane MacGowan in a book called Feckers, actually. It's not what it seems, because it's 50 people who fecked up Ireland. But Shane's citation goes that he was the guy who was the intimate outsider to Ireland, who, because he hadn't been born in here, was able to see things that we couldn't see because of our prejudices and our inferiority complex.
He embraced it.
He saw, like he went to see the Sex Pistols, and he thought, that's it. I'll do that to the songs that my drunken uncles used to sing, and it'll be sensational, and it was. And we never would have thought of that ourselves. And as soon as you hear it, I know I was kicking myself. How the hell did we miss that? And that was the key to it. He managed to do that healing thing, and Irish people loved it. Why? Because they recognise intuitively, this is us as we ought to be, but we haven't been. We can't. We're not. We haven't got the confidence to become this, to become Shane MacGowan, in those spectacular moments, like where he would just like stumble onto the stage, and go up to the microphone, and he got 1, 2, 3, and he would hit it like that, and it was just, it'd blow you away. It was amazing, and and Sinead O'Connor, she had it too. But you see, a lot of the attitudes that went to it didn't match, because the attitudes were destructive of the very thing that they were trying to nurture. Because the attitudes were all harking outside, looking beyond. There was a kind of a nostalgic affection for Ireland, but it was aimed outside. They were speaking to the outside world, really, as opposed to speaking to ourselves. And that's, the progressive thing and all that. That's a bad mixture. You can't do that. You've got to harmonise the whole thing. You've got to go back to your own people, like that, in a way, that's the kind of way I started off, you know, with my first book, with Driving at the Crossroads, was that's what it was, without me knowing what it was doing. Because that book, I've written about it recently. Paul Durkin, who died very recently, the poet, he was a friend of mine, and during the Mary Robinson election thing, I was covering Brian Lenihan's campaign. But I supported Mary Robinson at the time. In my head, in my heart, etc. I thought it was time to elect her, whatever, woman president. No problem, fine. But so I was covering Lenihan's campaign, and it was very powerful, because he'd just been through a very serious operation. Had been very ill. He was very thin, like he was emaciated almost. And I was with him on helicopters and trains and buses and everything for whatever, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And I got to know him very well, you know, and his son, young Brian, as well, who was with us, you know, and Bertie Ahern was with us. He was a director of elections. And but that time, you know, there was no mobile phones. You had your landline, and it was a habit that I had anyway. I think a lot of people had it, of having long phone calls, conversations at night. You know, you would go on for 3 hours. You wouldn't do it on a mobile now. You wouldn't stay on a phone like that for 3 hours. You couldn't. Your head would just fry, burn up. But then you could, and it would literally be like in the room with the person, you know. I remember Paul Durkin used to call me, you know, and other people as well, you know, and we'd have long conversations, maybe 2 or 3 times a week during the election particularly. And I wrote an article one day about Brian Lenihan's hand having swollen up from shaking hands with people. It was literally swollen up. And Paul was deeply moved by this. And he says, you have to write a book about this. I had no idea what he meant, you know. He says, this is, you have to write this book. And he says, I'll get you a publisher. My publisher will publish it. I'll tell them they must. So when I wrote the book in about 10 days, literally chapter a day. And I didn't know what I was writing, you know. I was writing a series of snapshots of the Ireland I'd grown up in and gone through up to the moment. And politics was, and my father, it's about my father, as I said, it was like our relationship, which was like, you know, typical father-son relationship. He was more like, in a sense, he was old enough to be my grandfather, really. He was 50 when I was born. And, but we had this, you know, but when, a huge part of it, I see, was that I was going back, having become a kind of a modern, lefty liberal type person, you know, in a lazy way, you know, wishy-washy kind of, and kind of in that sense, in Dublin, sort of being hot press, you know, all trendy, windy, and you know, I was looking a little bit down maybe at my background and where I came from, and this book brought me back. And that was, in a sense, what Durkin meant. I didn't know he meant that, but that's what he meant, that would happen. He knew that would happen. And he was a bit like that too, even though he kind of mixed in the same circles, you know. And we sort of fell out afterwards, or just grew apart, because I just became too much for him, I think, you know. You know, I was out there, you know. So so I wrote the book anyway, and of course it was like, for the first time, I was talking about Dublin 4 and how dismissive it was of the country and the people of the country and their belief systems and all this abortion stuff and all this stuff, which I was kind of a bit ambivalent, I think, at the time about, you know. I mean, I was keeping my mouth shut really in Dublin about it. But now suddenly I was saying, no, these are great people. John Healy had a wonderful phrase, you know, he used to call them the great but anonymous people. And that's so true. Like, they were tremendous people. Like, they're giants. Like, you know, and they're all gone now. But so that that book was the first time that kind of corrected my drift, if you like, into liberal leftism. It brought me back to where I came from, and I never stopped. I never deviated from that path again, because I started right out of that experience, out of that sense that these people were being insulted and abused and spat upon by Dublin by Dublin 4 and by the media and all this, like, and treated by, and that still is true, you know, even though now it's kind of like the D4 side have won the war or sort of thing, but in doing so they destroyed the country and ended it, terminated Ireland, unless. And so that's kind of the thing, I think, that about that, what I'm trying to do all the time is to find a code for people that they can identify with, that might allow them to be happy with what Ireland is and was and what it might become out of that, instead of trying to undo themselves, to un-Irish themselves, to shake off, you know, their past and their history. And, you know, because those tendencies have been disastrous for us.
There's something in it that really connected to that. It's 86. The plain people of Ireland, that was the phrase I was talking about.
Yes, that was the Miles McLuhan phrase. As the 60s were ushered in, the native elite was turning away from culture and nationalism and seeking a civilization in the higher forms of imported culture. The plain people of Ireland, meanwhile, were left to the tender mercies of the strange new metaphors beginning to envelop their lives. Yeah, and then I go on to quote from Luke Gibbons's book, From Megalith to Megastore, and this kind of contradictory images of Ireland that were emerging. You know, on the one hand, they wanted to bring, Bord Fáilte wanted to bring people in to look at thatched cottages and donkeys. On the other hand, you had these glass monoliths being built all over the, you know, for pharmaceutical companies and tech companies later on, and that's so true. There's a great book. We were talking about this recently. There's a fantastic book about this precise moment. David Handley's book. What's this again?
In Guilt and in Glory.
Yeah, In Guilt and in Glory. It's a fabulous book because it's set in the late 70s, and it seems to just be at the precise moment when all of this stuff was just boom, blowing up over around everybody. And some of it is actually obviously very thinly disguised reality. Like he talks about the factory down in Killala in Mayo, making this econonitrile, or using this stuff which has to be transported across the country, and if anything happened they would have to clear, you know, about 30 miles either side of the railway track or something like that, you know. And all of it, but it's an amazing book, and it's a strange thing. It struck me about it, Fergus, that, you know, David Handley, people will know him from representing Morning Ireland for years. Like, he was that tremendous, you know, voice, like that used to. Yeah, the greatest way of dealing with an interview when he wasn't prepared that I've ever heard, because you could see him in the studio, and a new guest would be ushered in, and somebody would be introducing the topic, and David would be ready, you know, and he wouldn't have a clue. You could tell. I mean, he would say to the person, he would, "Tell us what you know," you know, and I thought that was a brilliant way. Like you wouldn't need journalism courses. Just tell people that question, and you could go. You'd have enough to keep going, like, for the whole career, you know. But it's a tremendous book. I mean, I'm not saying that like it's a world-class book, and it's a book that is, you know, in the pantheon of Irish literature, has a fairly exalted place, I think, because it's so beautifully written and the characters are so beautifully constructed. You know, but it captures that moment, which is now, when you read it, extraordinarily prophetic of what would happen 40 years later. Like, it's just astonishing that he got so much. Now, he worked in Bord Fáilte, so he knows about this thing of this contradictory policy, like, of advertising two different Irelands, the schizophrenic island, you know, of Ireland, advertising as the place of thatched cottages and donkeys, and on the other hand, you know, come and poison you can come in, you can poison our landscape and we won't even notice, like, you know. And that was another aspect that was really actually advertised, you know. That the absorption capacity of the Irish landscape was a plus for companies seeking to who avoid environmental legislation in the United States and Germany and places like that, and say, come on, we don't care, come on. And that's, again, you know, these tremendous, again, you're back to the idea that, you know, the disaffection that so many Irish people had developed for their own country, or the indifference to it.
And there's an exchange in particular, for me, I think the most memorable exchange, where there's quite an idealistic character talking about the demise of the culture. And then there's a kind of a sneering character who's saying, well, what even is culture?
Yes.
And then the other fella says something like, he basically refuses to define what it is because it's something that should just be obvious.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really powerful... I don't know, can you describe that dialogue a bit? Or do you remember the scene I'm talking about?
I don't remember it precisely.
It's towards the end.
But I don't remember precisely. But I remember the passage. I remember the exchanges. There were several such exchanges. And they struck me as so kind of prophetic of the way people talk now, in a certain way. Of like, as soon as you say, well, Ireland is entitled to its existence, the Irish people are, and say, well, there's no such thing as Ireland, and there's no such thing as the Irish people, and we were all a mixture of people, and sure, look at, we were blacks to begin with, and sure, and it's like so reductive. Everything is like until there's nothing left, and but he seemed to be aware of that. Now, the interesting thing about the book is that there's no editorial line in the book. If you remember, would you agree with me on that?
What do you mean by that?
Well, he's not didactic. It's not
exactly. It's like he's hiding his own. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
He's not clear what his own stance is.
Which is perfect. He's right. You know. Yes. So it's left to the characters to you then engage with the characters and like, I suppose if the book, there's a great tragedy in it as well. I think that he never wrote another book, because I think the next one would have been even better. It would have to be, but he never did it. I don't know what the story is there. I suppose he was an RTE and all that, but you know, if I would say, and I don't want to say this in a sense as a criticism, because the book is so brilliant that anybody would want to own it, but there's a sense in which he does allow the book to be more about telling than showing, you know. There's a lot of telling in it. It is in the argumentation you're hearing, as opposed to, like, a lot of it is dramatized and the characterization is very strong, but it's you can tell that he was exercised in some way about what was happening to his country and about the inevitable consequences of it, you know. And I have no idea where he is now or what he would think of this. He's disappeared from the scene. He's probably advancing. I won't say he's elderly, because I'm only 10 years younger than him. So, you know, but what a brilliant book, and it's not talked about. Like, nobody else. I've never heard anybody else talk about it. Like, it's out there. You'll get an odd copy of it in a bookshop, a second-hand bookshop or a charity shop now and again, and it's, you know, I don't, you know, there's been very few novels in the last since then, I think, that were as good as it.
I was recommended by my uncle recently. It was a beautiful exchange, actually. He's a philosophy professor, and he's a specialist in Aquinas and Aristotle.
All right.
And I haven't read books properly since I was about 12, you know. And I'd come home with a book about Newman or someone, or some highfalutin thing, you know, and I would think, oh, well, Fran will approve of that because that's his shtick, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, read a novel, like, you know.
Yeah.
And it was the best advice I've ever been given. But specifically, he said, you should read some Walter Mackin.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But the irony, obviously, is that he's the philosopher. You think he will be telling you, or whatever, to read Aristotle. But it was a complete flip, you know. But, so he had the Bogman. I've loved them because he really brings to life some of these images that you talk about that people ridicule, like the thatched cottage. Or there's one really powerful scene where the protagonist in Seek the Fairland has upset the local people where he is. He got drunk one night, basically. He had an outburst, and the next day he starts to build his stone cottage, but they won't help him. He's doing it on his own, and he literally is digging up the stone with his bare hands, you know. And he has a young son kind of half helping him. But he literally does all these, and I might have a naive view of that, you know, the beauty of that task of building a stone cottage. But it's just so beautifully done, and the way he writes about Ireland with a clear affection.
Yes.
And
yes,
I've asked people, do you know Walter Mackin? And people, they kind of half nod.
They're
you know?
aware of him, but
they're aware of him, but not into
he's not
him.
a presence in the culture anymore.
No, and I kind of ask, well, why? What's going on? And people say things like, I've heard people say, oh, he's not really, he's not hip or something like that.
I'll tell you what it
he's
is.
not in vogue. But so I suppose I'm just throwing that out there. But maybe to be specific, does he maybe over sentimentalize certain things, or do you think he gets at a way of doing it right?
You see, I think that this is at the heart of the problem, or the part of the issue that we're talking about. If you take the idea of the thatched cottage, like, see, all Irish writers have wrestled with this idea of Irishness, and Patrick Kavanagh talked about this a lot, and he having written books, you know, like Mackin's or whatever, he would then dismiss them, like The Green Fool. He just said, no, that was you know, terrible. You know, he dismissed it, and even Terry Flynn, he dismissed it. He said that no, it was too crude and too Irishy. Now, you see, this is the paradox. I had the same experience one time. I did somebody asked me, the BBC asked me to write a movie script based on a book about Harry Gleeson, who was a man in Tipperary back in the 40s who was hanged for murdering a woman, and it turned out he was innocent. He's actually been pardoned very recently, but this is about 20 years ago I started writing this, and you know, Sean McBride was his lawyer, and so it was a very interesting thing, and I wrote this script which is more about him and McBride, and you know, McBride, who was the son of Major John McBride, and was executed after 1916, and here he was dealing with a man, and McBride's father, McBride had never known his father because Maud Gonne, his mother, wouldn't let him near him. They only met once, I think, and you know, she taught. That's why Sean McBride had this French accent, I used to speak like that, because she insisted he speaks French in Paris, so that he couldn't speak to his father. It's horrible. Like it was appalling. People don't know this again, you know. But anyway, I wrote this about, you know, set in Tipperary in the 1940s, and it was this Australian, you know, script doctor brought in to have a look at it and sort of make suggestions, and her verdict was that it was too Irish. And I said, how am I going to un-Irish a film about 1940s Ireland? Like, but this is a real issue. Like, I mean, sounds a crazy question, but actually it's a real question in Irish culture, and that's what you're talking about with people like Mackin. Because if they didn't come from Ireland, if they wrote the same book, you know, about somewhere else, about Greece, it would be regarded as a classic of world literature. But because it's about Ireland, and because of that hangover of colonial sort of inferiority complex, we can't see clearly. You see, there's this total paradox. Take the thatched cottage. Thatched cottage is an icon of Ireland past. So it has kind of residual notions of nostalgia and backwardness, and you know, crones and donkeys and all that sort of stuff. Cliches of the iconography of Ireland past, which is because it's a dead culture. It's a culture in a certain sense. It's a culture which is truncated and therefore can produce only artifacts, not art. That's a problem with it. But thatched cottage is also a house in which people can live and do. So it's just a house, you know? So it's not an iconography at all. It could actually quite easily, if this history had been different, just be a house, right? But it can't be. So what happens? You end up with someone like Roddy Boyes deciding he's going to write books exclusively about tower blocks or something, or housing estates. to escape that riddle of how do you write about Ireland when its culture has been severed and ripped apart and then started again in a different place and is now different but has no connections. Or what is an Irish novel? What is not an Irish novel? You look across the spectrum of modern Irish novelists, from Tobin, Banville, McDonagh, McCormack, they're the best ones, for example. They can't deal with that problem. They don't. They avoid it. So the books aren't even anything to do with Ireland, really. So this is a real issue, that I wrote a lot about it, and I think I went to see the Banshee of what is that, the movie, the Martin McDonagh movie again, in Inisharan. Banshees of Inisharan or something like that. It was an amazing movie. I liked it because he seems to understand this totally. And there's a thatched cottage in it. But it's very interesting. What happens to the thatched cottage in the end? It gets torched. Because it can't be dealt with in Irish culture. It's too much of a, it draws too much attention to itself in the wrong way. And you can't erase that association. So therefore you can't use it. So you have to use its antithesis or something. The tower block, for example. But that's just a reaction to the thatched cottage, so that doesn't work either. So what does the Irish novelist do? He pretends to be English. What does he do? He pretends to be English and writes books about Ireland that an English novelist might have written as if it was just another place. But it isn't another place. It's a sacred place. And nobody can capture that sacredness anymore. Mackin did, for sure. Lots of writers did. John Healy, actually, and he wasn't a novelist, he caught it with one fantastic book, 19 Acres. That's another, it's a real story, but it's a novel as well,
Yes.
It's an amazing book.
There's an affection, again, that I think that word is crucial. There's an actual positive feeling towards it. Do you know there is a love there?
Yeah,
but
again,
I have a couple of images from, this isn't an analysis, but just a couple of images from Death of an Irish Town come to mind. One of them being, this is a silly one maybe, but and it actually read just like something you would have written. He talks about the games, the kind of the fun arcade place, and you put the coins in, and he writes about how this particular machine probably gave out more money than it took in. The way he writes about that it really reminded me of you. Then there was one other image where the two lads who play handball, and they have to cycle to all the tournaments, so they're exhausted by the time they get to wherever the match is, so they always lose, But there's a young boy comes with them, and his job is to watch the bikes and the coats.
Yes.
That's that boy's job, that's his part in the thing. And then there's another bit, again, I think it's about this handball player, and Healy talks about how the local people had such pride in the handball player, which he was their local hero more than a fella who would have gone from the town and played for Mayo in the high, in the big leagues, But there was this.
I remember. I can't remember his name, and
we could find it, but there's a purity or something. Again, you'd be mocked for talking like this.
No,
but there's a pureness in that depiction, and that love that those people had for that man, and obviously vice versa,
Which was captured in the title of the chapter. Do you remember it?
No.
Down to Our Last Hero. And I remember when I was an editor in Dublin, I asked Healy to write a profile of Charlie Haughey, and he wrote a book about Haughey. Essentially, it was about 20,000 words long, the longest article ever in the magazine or any magazine. And he couldn't think of a name. And I was talking to him, and I said, I think I know the name of a title. I says, Down to Our Last Hero. He just erupted. He said, that's it. Because that's how he saw Haughey, He saw Haughey as a kind of a frustrated genius who had the capacity to save Ireland, but had too many, midgets swarming around his legs, even though he wasn't a very tall man. people who were jealous of him and who wanted to bring him down, and he never got it. That was Healy's thesis, and it's a highly persuasive one, that Haughey never got a clear run at government, but that he had that capacity. He was like kind of Trump before Trump, Haughey. You know, he had that capacity to do things and to just say, I'm going to do it now. And I often say to people, you know, when people start slagging Haughey, I kind of say, yeah, I hear you, yeah, but come here. Can you tell me the name of any Irish politician that gave you anything like that? That's the free travel pass. That's something. It's something. Every time I got in a bus or a train now, when I get on for nothing, I remember Charlie Haughey, because he wasn't the worst. And there's a lot of Mickey Mouse people trying to destroy his legacy and his reputation. He could have, if they'd allowed him to govern, he would have made a great job of it. But he never got a proper chance. However, that to go back to the thing about the writers, you see, we're really in terrible trouble with our whole artistic situation now, because there are no real, and I'm generalising, obviously there are people here and there who are doing tremendous work, and painting and poetry and so on, and they always get annoyed with me, these people, that I don't mention them, but you can't just throw in names gratuitously. In general, I say the Irish novel is screwed. There's no such thing anymore. Like, the people who might have written those great novels haven't. I mentioned one or two other names. They've written reasonably good novels, entertaining novels, but novels are not supposed to be entertainment. And there are reasons for that. They just can't look squarely at their own country, and that's because of all the things we're talking about, the confusions, the kind of head-wrecking stuff that's interfering in the way, and they can't see why is it that in the same way as this contradiction of the donkey and cart Ireland and the glass buildings and pharmaceutical factories side by side it doesn't gel, and it jars. The novelists, no novelist has been able to overcome that in Ireland, I think that Martin McDonagh probably came closest in his plays and in that movie, Banshee of Inisherin, I think it's called. It's a very beautiful movie, that, even though people they think it's kind of stage Irishy. It's not. It's parodic. It's a parody of stage Irishy. It's involuted in a very complex way. But I thought when he burned the torch, I think he's been reading what I've said about the cottage.
Wow.
That you have to extinguish, you have to burn it. The only way to deal with it is to burn it to the ground and start again. But start again from a new point of understanding of what the problem was and where we might have been if the problem had never happened. That's the key. Where would we have got to in our culture if the interruption had not happened? That's an imaginative feat, which can only be accomplished by a very energized and unified artistic community over decades, and hasn't even been begun yet, because there's no discussion about it, because all the discussion is about the wrong things. And this is all part of the struggle that I see as being necessary, but unfortunately the only movement that exists that is in any way oppositional to the regime that's in place and everything it does, where it basically buys all the artists and the writers off and buys their silence, and that the only opposition is not even alert. It has no cultural understanding whatsoever that I hear, and that's a big problem.